A cold-blooded killer snubbed out.
Justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more.
After decades of spreading terror and a 20-year hunt, the terrorist boss met a brutal end.
Killed by an American drone strike in Afghanistan.
Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, formerly bin Laden's right-hand man, and one of the masterminds behind 9/11, slain on a Kabul balcony.
Well, now he's not only broken and defeated, but dead.
It is a historic assassination and a possible turning point in the war on terror, or potentially a trigger for a new wave of attacks.
There's always the risk there will be retaliatory strikes.
In this Sky News special report, we take you inside the chase for one of the world's most wanted. We give incredible details from an operation where one mistake could mean catastrophe.
They wake up every single day looking, how can we kill this guy?
We track Zawahiri's campaign of terror, which left thousands dead.
Their acts are acts against humanity.
We take you to the scene of the assassination, an area feared to becoming a terrorist hotbed once again. A distinguished array of experts, including those who led the battle against terror groups, tell us how Zawahiri's killing changes the war on terror, and whether it can ever be won.
So it's a very difficult thing that relies on the architecture of the intelligence system.
Well, there's no better time than the present to end a devastating, almost 21-year war. This chapter in American and world history ought to end.
If you are a threat to our people, the United States will find you and take you out.
His evil actions had an incredible impact on the modern world. His killing could be the catalyst for yet more chaos.
There it is. There it is. The plane went right through the other tower of the World Trade Center.
That is a very hard thing to watch.
Watch closely at the right of your screen as a second jetliner heads for what even to the untrained eye looks like a surgical strike into the South Tower. Against a backdrop of gentle blue skies, a terrorist arrow pierces the heart of a city and a nation.
It was an attack of shocking scale. 9/11, 2001, a day of infamy. 19 terrorists took over 4 US passenger planes and crashed them in Pennsylvania, the Pentagon, and New York, killing almost 3,000 people.
But we stayed because our officer was trapped. We didn't come out of there. We were trying to dig him out. He was alive, and then it collapsed again on us.
Joseph Pfeiffer was New York's fire chief on that day. 343 of his men died in the World Trade Center towers, his brother Kevin among them.
Their acts are acts against humanity, acts against each one of us, our families, the people we care about.
The acts which forever changed the world were co-planned by an Egyptian doctor. Ayman al-Zawahiri grew up in this well-to-do neighborhood in Cairo, in a well-connected family. He was religiously devout, and as a teen was arrested for being involved with the Muslim Brotherhood extremist group, yet graduated from the School of Medicine as a dentist.
His father used to help him while he lived here. He used to pray at the mosque, and when he became a practicing dentist, his father bought him a clinic in a street nearby. He used to work at the clinic and used to have his own group of friends. They'd all be seen praying together.
But Zawahiri continued his connection with extremists. By the 1980s, he led the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. He was jailed for 3 years for plotting to kill the Egyptian president. He later fled for Pakistan, where he met a Saudi with a similar hatred for the West and grand plans for vengeance, Osama bin Laden. Merging their terror networks, the pair sought to punish the United States and the West for its political and military interference in the Middle East. Zawahiri served as bin Laden's right-hand man, his personal physician and main strategist.
His role for Al-Qaeda in planning past, strikes against the U.S. and our targets and our interests overseas, but also more recently inciting targets or inciting attacks against the U.S. and our interests overseas. That continued all the way up until his death. And so he had a major role in making the Al-Qaeda's targeting profile transnational, in making their fight against the U.S. truly transnational.
Al-Qaeda's attacks on a US warship in Yemen and embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed 200, were among those believed to be organized by Zawahiri. It gave him international notoriety and made him one of the world's most wanted men. Al-Qaeda's attacks on US soil sealed Zawahiri's fate. The US would chase him to the ends of the earth to end his campaign of terror.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
An international coalition led by the US and including Australian troops invaded Afghanistan in late 2001. It overthrew the Taliban government deemed to have been supporting Al-Qaeda. Zawahiri fled into the mountains of Helmand province, occasionally crossing into Pakistan. In 2011, a US Navy SEALs team raided bin Laden's Pakistan compound.
After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden and took custody of his body.
News which sparked jubilation in New York and surely dread in the man replacing bin Laden. Ayman al-Zawahiri assumed the leadership of Al-Qaeda and an even larger target on his head. The dentist from Cairo, who spread terror and death worldwide, was now living on borrowed time.
Zawahiri chose his own path and he was his own end because that's how he thought. A man who chose destruction, he got his punishment.
Smoke signals the death of a mass killer and the success of a 2-decade-long, world-spanning mission.
You're back with First Edition, and we begin with breaking news. American media is reporting the Al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is dead, killed by an American drone strike in Afghanistan.
Breaking tonight, 2 intelligence sources tell Fox News Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed in a CIA drone strike in Afghanistan over the weekend, just outside Kabul.
This is a very, very significant counter-terrorism operation, as the Americans are calling it. You can see him here, the leader of Al-Qaeda since 2011, since the Americans killed Osama bin Laden.
He was taunting the United States, taunting us about 9/11, taunting the messy withdrawal, saying we were broken and defeated. Well, now he's not only broken and defeated, but dead.
My fellow Americans, on Saturday, in my direction, the United States successfully concluded an airstrike in Kabul, Afghanistan that killed the emir of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more.
This was a strike months in the planning. According to a US official speaking on the condition of anonymity, CIA operatives have been on Zawahiri's tail for around 3 years, and they've been on high alert since last August's withdrawal of US troops. This year, they confirmed Zawahiri's wife, daughter, and grandchildren moved into a house in Kabul, a 3-story home in the Shapur district, close to Afghan dignitaries and meters from the UK embassy. The house is believed to have been owned by a Taliban official, and local authorities knew Zawahiri was residing there.
So it does reflect the continuing close relationship that clearly still exists between Al-Qaeda's senior leadership, that small group of Zawahiri and the others that is still left, and obviously the Taliban senior leadership. The fact that he was in Kabul, I don't think is something that could have been possible without the Taliban knowing that he was there.
After months of monitoring, intelligence officials were confident that the elderly man they saw routinely venture onto the balcony, but never outside the premises, was the Al-Qaeda leader.
You have to understand that these targeteers, these intelligence officials, the operators who conduct the operations have extensive, and I'm talking about they wake up every single day looking, how can we kill this guy? Because he is such a threat. And this has been going on for months. The average American doesn't understand the detail, the level of effectiveness and efficiencies that go into this kind of targeting of individuals.
In April, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan briefed President Joe Biden. An assassination plan was drafted. On July 1, that plan was delivered to President Biden. This picture from that meeting shows a box in front of the president. Officials say inside was a scale model of the Zawahiri house. The president demanded specific details on its design and an assurance no one else would be killed in the attack.
It does require very good intelligence on the ground, frankly, and as well as other sources of intelligence to be able to make sure that you have the right target, because that would be a horrendous mistake if you don't have the right target.
There was good cause for caution. The US botched an assassination attempt in 2006. An airstrike on a Pakistan village missed Zawahiri, but killed 18 civilians. It's believed that wasn't the only failed attempt on his life.
I have to believe that Zawahiri let his guard down after the U.S. left Afghanistan, and because he was meticulous about his operational security, certainly during the Obama years, in my time as DNI. And we had great difficulty trying to find him because he isolated himself quite successfully, both physically and electronically.
On July 25, President Biden gave the order to cut off Al-Qaeda's head.
In this case, we used an unmanned aerial vehicle with missiles, obviously, and 2 of those missiles were fired at Mr. Zawahiri while he was outside on that 3rd floor balcony. The president made it very clear when he made the decision, but he wanted to make sure we avoided civilian casualties, and we know we did.
At least 1 Hellfire missile was used, with the explosive force of a hand grenade. The White House claims no one else was killed, unlike this strike in the same city last year, which targeted a terrorist but killed 10 civilians, including 7 children. The US does not have DNA evidence, but is certain this time they got their man.
I'll tell you that it's a combination of visual evidence and evidence collected through other means that led us to the certainty before that this was the guy, and that led us to the conclusion after, with a high degree of confidence, that he was no more.
This is a huge success for the U.S. and for the global coalition. At the same time, one strike does not define a whole strategy. In the 11 to 12 months since the U.S. left Afghanistan, this is one of only a handful of strikes that have eliminated terrorists. One of those strikes was errant and killed 7 civilians, including a former U.S. humanitarian contractor. And so, we have a small sample of strikes. It is early days for the strategy right now, but nonetheless, it is a significant blow to Al-Qaeda and its global network of affiliates.
And for Joe Pfeiffer, 21 years of pain eased just a little.
Hearing the news that one of the masterminds of 9/11 was taken out allowed me a sense of closure. It allowed us victims of terrorism to have a voice, that we're heard, that terrorists won't be tolerated.
Coming up, the end of Al-Qaeda or a re-strengthening? What does Zawahiri's death mean for the terror group and its deadly ambitions? Plus, fears the Taliban is hiding even more dangerous figures and calls for an official end to the war on terror.
A world of endless drone strikes is not going to make the United States safer. It's not going to make people around the world safer.
Only the Americans. The Americans, yes.
There's relative quiet in a capital which has seen so much conflict and chaos in recent years. Kabul residents disbelieving and indifferent to the attack in their city, which stunned the world.
I don't think it is true. It's just propaganda. In reality, I don't think he was killed here. It was just an attack to create fear among the people and stress them out.
The Americans are certain of Zawahiri's demise and that the Taliban was attempting to keep him safe.
Well, it certainly means that he felt completely comfortable coming back to a crowded city, kind of more posh neighborhood. He was out with his family. I mean, he certainly did not feel a whole lot of fear. I mean, that's a real problem, right? We want these groups to be under stress so they can't organize, they can't mobilize, or they have a harder time doing it.
And there are fears Al-Qaeda is regaining its strength here. A US congressional report released earlier this year found there had been some progress in Taliban counter-terrorism commitments, and that while Al-Qaeda has the intention but not the capability to conduct external operations, it could reconstitute that capability in 1 or 2 years in the absence of sustained counter-terrorism pressure.
Against a long-standing ally like Al-Qaeda, the Taliban simply are not effective counterterrorism partners.
Desperation may drive terrorist recruitment. Afghanistan's economy has shrunk 40% since the Taliban retook control last year. More than 90% of citizens are living in poverty. The situation is made worse by the US blocking the government from accessing $7 billion of its overseas-held central bank funds. Meanwhile, the new Al-Qaeda leader may already have been identified. The likely contenders include Egyptian Saif al-Aid, Abdul Rahman al-Maghrebi, or from one of Al-Qaeda's affiliates, Yazid Mubarak or Ahmed Diriyeh.
Al-Qaeda was something of a lesser organization for much of al-Zawahiri's leadership of Al-Qaeda. But most recently, especially with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, successes of Al-Qaeda affiliates in Afghanistan, as well as in South Asia, Pakistan and India, and on the African continent, the organization had basically turned a corner at the same time that the Islamic State was receding following the decline of the global movement and certainly the caliphate in Iraq and Syria. And so his successor is basically faced with the choice of picking up those reins, reaffirming pledges of allegiance from Al-Qaeda's various networks, and trying to continue on where al-Zawahiri left off.
Multiple terror groups are thought to be operating out of areas along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, including ISIS-K with an estimated 4,000 fighters, which the US believes could establish an external attack capability against the United States or its allies in 12 to 18 months, but possibly sooner if the group experiences unanticipated gains in Afghanistan.
Terrorism, unfortunately, as a concept and as a practice has been around for a very long time. What we've seen is that it tends to morph into new directions, and unfortunately that's probably what we're going to see now.
The United States has updated its travel advice for Afghanistan following Zawahiri's death, stating there's a higher potential for anti-American violence. Cutting off Al-Qaeda's head hasn't killed its threat. The strike on Zawahiri demonstrates the United States' new tact in tackling terrorist groups. These are now arguably its most important weapons. Drones like the MQ-9 Reaper and Predator are often operated from hubs thousands of kilometers away. They are routinely deployed in conflict zones. They monitor enemy movements and can fire multiple missiles in one sortie. The US is moving to what it calls an over-the-horizon military strategy, relying on dominance in the air rather than having boots on the ground.
Of course, when you delve down deeper into the question of, well, is over-the-horizon really a workable strategy? Are we really going to be able to detect terrorist threats and plots rather than, vis-a-vis chasing down one and the biggest high-value target there was, are obviously two very different stories.
But it's not a surefire strategy. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism estimates around 2,000 civilians were killed in US drone strikes over a 16-year period. A New York Times investigation last year, citing Pentagon documents, found US airstrikes have been marked by, quote, deeply flawed intelligence. The paper cites one strike, which US Special Forces claimed killed 85 ISIS fighters, actually killed 120 civilians. Relying on air power alone to fight terrorist groups and take out their leaders may not be possible.
If you don't have people on the ground, you can do those kinds of things, but it's a lot harder to do them because you need to rely on technology. You need to rely on satellites. You need to rely on, perhaps instruments that are left behind by others, and those kinds of things. So it's a very difficult thing that relies on the architecture of the intelligence system.
It is a sight both beautiful and humbling. In New York's 9/11 memorial, reflecting pools fill the enormous footprint of the collapsed towers. Almost 3,000 names are inscribed along its borders. While the scale of the loss in the infamous attacks is difficult to comprehend, it is but a drop in the ocean in the war which followed, the so-called War on Terror. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, which Ayman al-Zawahiri helped orchestrate, then US President George W. Bush declared a global battle against terrorism, and the nations the US deemed were supporting terrorist groups.
All nations will heed our call and eliminate the terrorist parasites who threaten their countries and our own. Make no mistake about it. If they do not act, America will.
That started an unprecedented global military endeavor. American action began in Afghanistan and Iraq, before engaging in smaller conflicts in Syria, Pakistan and Somalia. The pretense was to push back against terrorism, but the destruction wrought often triggered a surge in terrorist recruitment and attacks.
So the war on terror itself will generate its own enemies and continue toward the destabilization of America and so much else of the world unless it is actively ended.
Brown University's The Cost of War project has been tracking the war on terror's toll over 2 decades. It estimates around 929,000 people have been killed in associated conflicts, around 380,000 of them civilians. That figure may actually be much higher. The US often categorizes all men of fighting age to be enemy combatants.
The drone strike footage you see may or may not disturb you, because without knowing the underlying context behind it, you just see another drone strike.
An investigation by website Connecting Vets also found American forces were attacking unarmed Afghans.
In the footage you see strike after strike against men where there are no firearms present.
Similar episodes have been reported in other conflict theaters. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Spencer Ackerman has spent years chronicling US actions in the Middle East. He believes now is a fitting time to officially declare an end to the war on terror.
You can use, should the political establishment wish to, the death of Zawahiri to contend that this chapter in American and world history ought to end. And ending it doesn't mean anything if it's simply a rhetorical declaration. Ending it means the abolition of the operations and the authorities of the war on terror that were granted and sold to the American people as emergency measures.
There is a dark irony to Zawahiri's death. The Taliban's support for him and his fellow 9/11 plotters triggered the US invasion and overthrow of the Taliban. The group later reclaimed the country and seemingly welcomed back the Al-Qaeda leader, who was remotely killed by the Americans. US agents were chasing him for decades. After several failed attempts and months of meticulous planning, they finally ended the life of one of the world's most wanted men.
Now, justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more.
His assassination suggests Al-Qaeda is active, and the Taliban may be shielding their members. There remains a terrorist threat, albeit considerably diminished, and tackling it doesn't necessarily require boots on the ground. The two main figures associated with the notorious terrorist attack 21 years ago are dead. Yet the far more deadly war on terror launched in 9/11's wake continues. This hunt for evil ended with a coveted scalp. The hunt for all of Ayman al-Zawahiri's ilk is far from over.